My name is Greyson Thela, and I'm the Legal Advocacy Coordinator at Gender DynamiX. And my responsibility within the organization is to champion legal gender recognition using our legal frameworks and our constitution in the Republic of South Africa. There's a disconnect in society when we talk about identity and sexual orientation. Quite commonly, we refer to people with a difference in sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression as LGBTI or queer people. But unfortunately, it's not one. The lived experiences of individuals who are LGBTI identifying are completely different. Lesbian, gay, and bisexual refer to sexual orientation, which is, of course, the attraction from one individual to another. And of course, the T and the I speaks to sexual characteristics of intersex persons and speaks to gender identity of trans and gender diverse persons. So the two are completely different, and you would note that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people who are not trans identifying also carry a great deal of privilege in society, and we call that privilege cisgender privilege. And cisgender privilege is privilege that everyone that is not trans identifying has. An example would be the use of a bathroom that speaks to your own gender identity. And of course, gender expression is how you express yourself, how you express your identity as an individual. We should note on that note that gender expression is not something that is constant, but however ever changing, particularly when you refer to non-binary individuals or individuals who are gender non-conforming. So it's not constant, but of course ever changing. As a continent, as an African continent, our lived experiences and who we are has always been criminalized. If you reflect, particularly in the South African context, where you've got the colonial government, or as many people may know, or know them as the apartheid government, introduced laws that effectively criminalized your identity. And I'm talking on a broad scale, you're speaking to people with a difference in sexual orientation and gender identity. And these laws stem from 1927 upwards, so they're quite historic and marginalizing identity. So of course this legalistic framework has of course been passed on from generation to generation and uplifted and strengthened by unhelpful religious beliefs and of course unhelpful cultural beliefs. And as trans people for a very long time, we haven't had the right to self-determine ourselves, we haven't had the right to bodily autonomy and the right to legal gender recognition. And this is what we're facing as a country and as a continent currently, where laws are always set in the binary context and not necessarily opening up for diversity. So you can only imagine that on the African continent, given our history speaking to race and now speaking to identity, there's always been a disconnect. If you look at countries within the SADC region, for example in Zimbabwe, legal gender recognition for trans and gender diverse persons are criminalized. You look at Malawi, they're criminalized. So effectively that changes how you view your world and your lived experience and how you maneuver in the world. And with your identity being criminalized, you also cannot access gender-affirming healthcare. But it's also very important to note that not every trans individual wants access to gender-affirming healthcare or wants to affirm their identity medically. And unfortunately, in some countries, if your identity is criminalized, you cannot access gender-affirming healthcare, which then results in persons quite often going behind closed doors and accessing gender-affirming healthcare, which is not necessarily always healthy, as you have to monitor it through proper procedures like going to the doctor as often as possible to make sure that you're in good health. But unfortunately, this is something that is not accessible. And when we talk about accessible, we talk about one, privilege. Number two is the socioeconomic status of someone. Currently in South Africa, medical aids unfortunately do not offer gender-affirming healthcare. They see it as cosmetic, and subsequently you find that people are left to do access gender-affirming healthcare, whether it be primary or secondary, using their own money and their own financial backing. Unfortunately, our public institutions, our public hospitals have very, very long waiting lists of about 25 years long. So you can imagine that people will affirm themselves as trans and gender diverse, but will never actually have the access to affirm their identity medically. And that speaks, of course, to mental wellness, that speaks to body dysphoria, and also heightens the vulnerability and violence that one can possibly be faced with on the street, with the incongruency between how you determine and how society views you. And that, of course, creates a major vulnerability. And you see that within the African continent, where our identities have become the greatest danger of all, where we have also an influx of trans and gender diverse asylum seekers and refugees seeking refuge in South Africa because their identities are criminalized. As we maneuver through life, I think we should always be cognizant of the fact that we've got a constitution that speaks to the lived experiences of everyone. The constitution of South Africa, or the Republic of South Africa, says that you cannot discriminate against people based on sex, gender. If those two terms meant the same thing, there wouldn't be a common between the two words, which speaks to the lived experience. Currently, right now, as a society, particularly civil society, we've got two major issues that affect trans and gender diverse persons and subsequently intersex persons as well. I'll start with intersex persons. Currently in South Africa, when everyone is born, the South African framework or the population registry only makes reference to the binary form, which is male or female, but has no idea or makes provision for intersex persons or for trans and gender diverse persons. When a baby is born and sex assigned at birth is male or female, the reason why we use the word sex assigned is because someone told you that you are a particular sex and that you did not affirm yourself as a particular sex. Now, the issue that one faces is that when you find an intersex baby, and there's a wide variety of intersex babies, 1 in every 2,000 births, by the way, are intersex babies, and there's a wide array of variations of an intersex person. But the most common one is when you are born with both external genitalia of what is typically considered female or typically considered male. And now subsequently, this then informs intersex genital mutilation, as the baby and how the baby is born needs to fit into the population registry of the country. So you can imagine the amount of individuals whose dignity and lived experience and bodily autonomy has been ripped away from them because they did not have the right to self-determinate. So that's the one issue that I think South Africa, as a South African population, need to focus on, that there are babies there who are being mutilated without they say so, and the repercussions of that mutilation are lifelong. And of course, that's the one thing. And then, of course, with transgender persons, the sex assigned at birth is not congruent to how you identify yourself. Because you must remember that gender identity is what determines what pronoun you use, whether it's he, she, they, or them. And I think it's also very important to note that there is non-binary individuals who don't identify as he or him, but identify as they, them. And I think it's very important to note that this does not necessarily also reflect the nature of our legal framework at Home Affairs, because Home Affairs only recognizes two sexes currently, which is male or female. And we're calling for a third unspecified gender marker that speaks to trans and gender diverse persons who are non-binary, people who are non-binary, and of course intersex persons who may or may not want to choose a male or female. And I think that's very important, because that determines how you maneuver life. When you open a bank, that's an issue. Applying for housing, that's an issue. Because currently in the South African context, you apply for a gender marker change, you apply for a name change, because typically when your parents name a baby, it's based on sex assigned at birth. And as a trans individual, you might not necessarily affirm or necessarily want to use that particular name because it doesn't affirm your identity. So Act 49 then subsequently allows you to do a gender marker change and a name change. But however, the process in doing so takes forever. And as they're taking forever now, currently your life needs to go on. You need to apply for jobs, you need to apply for housing, you need banking, a wide array of things. So now the issue comes in where you apply, you undergo gender affirming healthcare, and your body changes. How you express yourself changes, your voice changes. So this then creates an issue when you speak to service delivery, because Home Affairs is taking forever with your documents. And subsequently, when you do eventually receive your ID that has the correct gender marker, that your ID number changes. That subsequently means that you need to go back and change your license, you need to go back and change your degrees, every single document that had your previous ID and your previous gender marker needs to change. And of course, this also applies to a driver's license. So you could imagine, Greyson jumps into a car, off he goes to work Gender DynamiX and gets stopped by a traffic officer, and he says, "License and registration, please." And I give him my license and registration, which is in my dead name and my dead gender marker that I don't affirm with. And of course, now you put in a predicament where this officer thinks that you faked your license, and off you go, he arrests you. Or sometimes you find that he understands and says, "Okay, I understand, off you go, you have a good day." But the minute you turn the corner, you might get stopped by a different police officer. And of course, this continues on a consistent basis. And on that note, also, there's a great deal of gatekeeping that comes to one affirming themselves as trans and gender diverse legalistically. Currently, children and refugees and asylum seekers don't have that particular access. A child currently in the South African context, legalistically, can access services that speak to sexual and reproductive health. They can terminate a pregnancy at the age of 12 without a guardian being present or a guardian signing off on it. But however, when you want to do so at Home Affairs, change your gender marker, you need to be accompanied by a parent. And that's the gatekeeping that happens. And of course, we've spoken about at length refugees and asylum seekers who are trans-identifying, that this particular identification that affirms you is not available. However, you can affirm yourself medically, but of course, how you represent and what your document says, of course, creates a problem where you have to face law enforcement, and these are the vulnerabilities that exist. I think it's also quite imperative to note that there have been some massive victories within society where Gender DynamiX acted as amicus curiae in the Jade September case, where Jade September was a transgender woman who got incarcerated in a male prison. And you cannot discriminate against me based on sex and gender. And that needs to be reflective within the correctional services scene. And subsequently, we won the case, and Jade could choose which prison she goes to. And of course, this it's available to everyone who's incarcerated, who affirms themselves as a trans person, to choose which prison they can go to. And I think that's massive. That's a massive stride. But however, society also needs to recognize that there's schooling, there's higher education where trans and gender diverse persons don't necessarily have that access. You find a large number of trans and gender diverse persons who are unhomed because family does not agree with who they identify with, and subsequently then either flee home or get chased out. And then you're left fending for yourself on the street. Particularly in Cape Town, there's a high number of unhomed trans and gender diverse persons. And of course, this is because that society and the community does not necessarily agree with the identity. So I think it's very important that we reflect that. But I think what's also very important, particularly for journalists, is that when you are covering a story that speaks to trans and gender diverse persons, you should always look at socioeconomic status. You should look at, of course, segregation as well. And these are legacies of apartheid, where you had the Immorality Act of 1927, 1929. And of course, that affected also spatial segregation, where South African context, the whites were put aside, colors were put aside, and blacks were put aside. There's a high number of hate crimes and hate speech in the black community with minimal policing. And of course, our white counterparts don't have the same experience, whether you're trans-identifying or not, because privilege plays a massive role in safety, in access, and of course in opportunity. And I think this is something that we need to shine a light on. Access to higher education is a problem, as our system and our structure and society was never built for us, and something that one can note, the difference between equality and equity. An example is a toilet. Equality is a male and female toilet. Equity is bridging the gap by providing a male, female, and gender inclusive toilet. And that is equity, and these are things that society needs to get accustomed to, because it shines on the principles of the Constitution. And this, of course, affects life as you know it in schools as well. Currently schools are slowly but surely adopting an inclusive way of speaking to children who are trans and gender diverse, where some are scrapping uniforms completely, and across the line everyone wears golf shirts, because the schooling system is also very cis-normative and heteronormative, where there's a boy line and a girl line, there's boy uniform and girl uniform, where the child can speak for themselves. The child can affirm their identity and say, this is not who I am, and we need to respect that. You are who you say you are, regardless of who tells you what. If you say that you are trans, you are trans. If you say that your pronoun is he, your pronoun is he, and society should respect that. I think it's very imperative that when you speak to or engage with the trans community as a whole, you must always remember that you need to affirm one's dignity, a right to bodily autonomy and self-determination. And self-determination being the most important aspect in one's identity. Firstly, we need to respect one's pronoun, whether they use they, them pronouns or he or she. So it's very important that you affirm one's name, use the name that they go by. Don't say, but what is the name your mother gave you? That is inappropriate, highly inappropriate. It's also extremely inappropriate to ask someone what's in your pants. We don't go around asking cis people what's in your pants, or how do you have sex. That's highly inappropriate. You can Google it, if you must know. But those are some of the things that you don't do. You don't. You find that there are trans and gender diverse activists that, of course, provide pictures of themselves in documenting their journey. And this, of course, is an educational tool. But outing someone's pictures that they no longer use without their consent is firstly against the law. And secondly, it's highly inappropriate to trans and gender diverse persons, because that also increases your vulnerability as a trans person. Because then you find that transphobic individuals or homophobic individuals would like to inquire what genitalia you have. So outing someone, you need to firstly ask permission to use their pictures. You don't use their pictures without their consent. It goes against the Protection of Personal Information Act that South Africa has currently introduced recently. Affirm one's pronouns, affirm one's gender identity, use one's preferred name and pronoun. Do not out anyone. Do not out anyone's ID number, because currently ID numbers have a determining number that states whether you have male assigned at birth or female assigned at birth. So these are some of the things that you just generally don't do. It's not what you say, it's how you say it as well, which one should always be cognizant of. You can inquire for educational purposes, but also we should always remember that dignity and respect should always be behind the inquiry that you are making. How you ascertain one's gender identity or pronoun that you use, you can do so by not asking evasive questions, but asking a simple question like, my name is Greyson, my pronoun is he, him. What is your pronoun? And then from there you acquire the person's pronoun that you can use. Don't ask what is the sex assigned at birth. Don't ask what did your mother name you. Particularly with names as well, because names are very problematic as well. You might find that your mother gives you the name Jack because sex assigned at birth was male, but you don't identify as Jack. You identify as Jacqueline. You use Jacqueline. So don't assume something that you think is correct, and also ask in an invasive way. And I think as a people, we know deep down, we know the right questions to ask, and we know the wrong questions to ask that sensationalize and speaks to sexualizes literally trans and gender diverse bodies and intersex bodies as well. So don't ask a question like what's in your pants. That's highly inappropriate. These are not conversations that one should be asking. So you can inquire what you want to inquire, but in a respectful manner. And of course, always ask for someone's opinion, and also ask for someone's permission as well. It's very imperative that you ask for someone's opinion. So how you ask a name, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. You can inquire about sexual characteristics if there's an educational spin on it. If you want to shine a light on intersex genital mutilation, if you want to shine a light on the fact that doctors are currently keeping medical records away from the public because they know what they're doing is wrong. So how you frame your question, has to always speak to human dignity at all times. LGBTIQ persons, people quite often only make reference to lesbian and gay and then just an umbrella term. And sometimes I think that it's like a potjie course where you throw everything in one pot, but actually the lived experience is different. When we talk about trans and gender diverse persons, the lived experience speaks to the structure, speaks to access. And when we talk about sexual orientation, speaks to a wide variety of other issues that don't necessarily speak to structure. Highlight sexual orientation, because sexual orientation speaks to attraction. There's also sexual pleasure as well. And quite often you find that people think that men who have sex with men, women who have sex with women are gay. Not necessarily gay. It's very important that you highlight that sexual pleasure is not connected to sexual orientation and is not connected to gender identity. Because if that was the case, every man that has sex with another man in prison would ultimately be gay, which is not the case. And that is sexual pleasure. So it's very important to break down these concepts neatly, tidily, and also explain and express the privilege that comes with not being trans. which speaks to the use of pronouns, the use of having your gender as an option on the form. You need to unpack the lived experiences of trans and gender diverse persons who also have a sexual orientation. Because you might find that a transgender man may identify as gay, may identify as bisexual, and vice versa with trans women. So you need to always unpack sexual orientation, unpack sexual pleasure, and unpack gender identity, because those three things have different implications in society. Understand that journalists have they've got a huge responsibility of they can either break down society or educate society, because people look at this in media, people look at this on paper, on newspapers, in a wide variety of ways. So how you document this particular information can determine whether someone lives or dies, because our identities have become the greatest danger of all in society. So it's very important that journalists take this into consideration when speaking to a person or people with a difference in identity and sexual orientation. Educate yourself. Take the time to sit down and read a book. Sit down and Google. In the very same way society does with every other thing, you can do so for trans and gender diverse persons and people with a difference in identity. This is Greyson Thela, and thank you so much for watching Tips on Reporting on Trans and Gender Diverse Persons.